The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. Picture yourself in a racing shell, a sliver of cedar so delicate you can feel every ripple of water beneath you. It's August 14th, 1936, in Berlin, Germany. Cold rain pounds down on you, and gusting wind threatens to tear the 12-foot oar right out of your grip. 75,000 voices surround you, most of them chanting for your defeat. Deutschland! Deutschland! They scream, arms raised in salute to the man watching from shore, Adolf Hitler himself. You're stuck in the worst lane, completely exposed to the wind's fury. Next to you, the British crew glides smoothly. They're the darlings of international rowing. In the protected lanes, the German and Italian boats, hand-picked favorites of the Nazi regime, are pulling ahead. And here's the kicker. The young man setting your rhythm, the heartbeat of your entire crew, is desperately sick. His face is ghostly pale, eyes barely open, slumped over his oar like he might pass out any second. Your boat is dead last. Your dream, your country's dream, is slipping away with every stroke. So how did you end up here? And more importantly, what the hell do you do now? This is the moment at the heart of Daniel James Brown's masterpiece, The Boys in the Boat. This book has sold millions of copies and captured hearts worldwide, but it's not just another sports story. It's about what we're capable of when the world has completely written us off. It's about 9 working-class American kids, hardened by the Great Depression, who found greatness not through raw talent or brute strength, but by discovering a secret to teamwork so profound it felt almost magical. By the time we're done today, you'll understand what true resilience actually means. It's not about being tough and going it alone. That's the easy answer. It's about something deeper and far more powerful. It's about learning to trust, to surrender your ego, and to find strength not just in yourself, but in the people beside you. This is how 9 young men who had every reason to quit discovered something almost divine, and I promise you, this lesson will stick with you long after the story ends. Our story doesn't start in a boat. It starts in a world that felt like it was drowning. The year is 1933, and America is on its knees, crushed by the Great Depression. In Seattle, Washington, like everywhere else, hope is in dangerously short supply. Men who once built skyscrapers now sell apples on street corners. Families huddle in makeshift shantytowns called Hoovervilles, cobbled together from scrap tin and tar paper, bracing for another brutal winter. The ground feels like it could give way beneath anyone at any moment. But on the University of Washington campus, a different world exists. Here, young men in pressed slacks and cardigan sweaters discuss football games and classes, trying to build futures in a world that seems to have none to offer. On one particular autumn afternoon, 2 of these young men, both unusually tall, make their way down a long, grassy slope toward an old, weathered building on Lake Washington's shore. It's a converted airplane hangar from the Great War that now serves as the university's shell house, home of the rowing team. One of these young men is Joe Rantz. He's tall and blond with broad shoulders and an intense, quiet demeanor. To the girls who watch him pass, he looks like a movie star. But Joe knows a harsh reality they can't see. His sweater isn't crisp or new. It's a rumpled hand-me-down. His shoes are worn through. He doesn't belong in this world of cardigans and briar pipes. He's here on a desperate prayer, and that prayer depends entirely on what's about to happen in that shell house. For Joe, making the freshman crew team isn't about glory or prestige. It's about basic survival. A spot on the team guarantees a part-time campus job. That job, combined with the meager dollars he's scraped together from backbreaking labor, is the only thing keeping him in college. Failure means going back to a cold, half-built house on the Olympic Peninsula, alone, with nothing ahead but odd jobs and maybe, if luck really runs out, a spot in a soup kitchen line. For Joe Rantz, this isn't a tryout, it's a lifeline. To understand why this moment means everything, we need to go back, because Joe's journey to that shell house was longer and darker than any of the other 174 boys standing there could possibly imagine. Joe's life started with promise. His father Harry was a brilliant mechanic and inventor in Spokane, Washington. But when Joe was just 4 years old, his world shattered. His mother died a slow, agonizing death from cancer. The image of her coughing blood into a handkerchief would sear itself into his memory forever. His father, completely broken by grief, couldn't handle it. He packed his bags and fled to the wilds of Canada, abandoning Joe. Joe got shuffled from relative to relative, a small boy alone on trains, watching the world flash past while a heavy sense of fear and dread settled on his young shoulders. Eventually, his older brother Fred took him in, and for a brief moment, stability seemed possible. His father Harry came back from Canada and, in an odd twist, married Thula, the twin sister of Joe's brother's wife. Joe went to live with his father and new young stepmother. But this new family was fragile from the start. Thula was a talented violinist who dreamed of playing in grand European orchestras, and now she was stuck in a life she despised, raising another woman's son. Joe's very presence was a constant, unwelcome reminder of her husband's first marriage. Then one night, disaster struck again. The family home burned to the ground. The only thing Harry saved, risking his life to push it from the flames, was his first wife's piano. Standing in the flickering firelight, 9-year-old Joe felt that cold fear return. Home, it seemed, was something you just couldn't count on. The family moved to a remote gold mining camp in the Idaho mountains called Boulder City. For Harry, it was a tinkerer's paradise. For young Joe, it was a wonderland of adventure. But for Thula, it was a desolate prison. The tension in their small, rough-hewn cabin became unbearable. She was stuck with her own young children, and a stepson she increasingly saw as an obstacle to her happiness. Finally, she gave Harry an ultimatum. It was her or Joe. His father chose her. He took 10-year-old Joe up to the one-room schoolhouse at the top of the hill and left him there. Joe was to live alone in the school, chopping wood for heat in exchange for a place to sleep. To eat, he had to trudge down the mountain every morning and evening to work in the camp's cookhouse. He was 10 years old, and he'd been abandoned. Again. This was the moment that forged the man who would one day sit in an Olympic shell. Alone in that schoolhouse, a new resolve hardened in Joe's heart. He was done being scared, hurt, and left behind. From that day forward, he would rely on absolutely no one but himself. He would make his own way, find his own path to happiness. He would survive, and he'd do it alone. And survive he did. He learned to forage for food, finding mushrooms in the woods. He learned that if you kept your eyes open, you could find value where others saw nothing. When the family moved again, this time to a stump farm in Sequim, Washington, things didn't improve. Then, at the dawn of the Great Depression when Joe was 15, it happened again. He came home from school one day to find the family car packed. His father and Thula were leaving for Seattle, taking the younger children with them. There was no room for Joe. They drove away into the rain, leaving him standing alone in the driveway of a cold, half-finished house. He was on his own, for good. For the next few years, Joe Rantz became a one-man force of nature. He poached salmon from the river and sold them to the local butcher. He dug ditches, built barns, and cut hay. He swung an axe and split cedar logs into fence rails, his body growing strong and lean. He worked with a logger named Charlie McDonald, learning to read the grain of wood, how to find its inner strength. And he put himself through high school, all while living completely alone. During this time, he taught himself to play banjo and guitar. Music became his solace, his way of connecting with others without having to depend on them. He played on the school bus, and that's where he caught the eye of a pretty, intelligent girl with blonde curls named Joyce Simdars. She saw past his rough clothes and guarded nature. She saw his strength, his resourcefulness, and the deep well of kindness he tried so hard to hide. She saw in him the embodiment of freedom, and she decided that one day she'd help make up for how cruelly the world had treated him. Joe's brother Fred urged him to come to Seattle for his senior year of high school, telling him it was his only shot at getting into the University of Washington. And there, in the school gymnasium, a tall man in a dark suit spotted Joe practicing on the high bar. The man was Al Ulbrickson, head rowing coach for the University of Washington. He saw raw power and grace in the young man and left his card with Fred. After another brutal year of labor to save tuition money, Joe finally arrived on campus, clutching that card, his heart full of desperate hope. And so we return to that fall afternoon in 1933, with Joe Rantz standing on the dock of the Shell House in a place that would transform his life forever. Rowing, you need to understand, is a sport of almost beautiful cruelty. It demands absolutely everything from you. Every muscle, legs, back, arms, gets pushed to its absolute limit, over and over, without respite. As one writer described it, there's no place to stop and get a satisfying drink of water. You just keep your eyes glued on the red, sweating neck of the guy ahead of you and row until they tell you it's over. The pain is immense. But for the boys trying out for Washington Crew in 1933, the rewards were just as great. And for Joe Rantz, the stakes were higher than for anyone else there. The freshman coach was a young man named Tom Bowles. He was a history major with a scholarly air, but he knew his job was to weed out the weak. He told the boys that the path they were choosing was almost beyond imagining, that their bodies and characters would be tested, and that most of them would be gone by Christmas. Watching from the doorway was head coach Al Ulbrickson. He was a man of few words, a dour Dane as the sports writers called him, tall and powerfully built with cold, slate-gray eyes that could silence anyone instantly. He'd grown up with modest means and rowed his own way to greatness at Washington. Now rowing was his religion, and his job was winning converts. But there was another man at the Shell House, a figure who seemed to belong to a different era. In the loft at the back, a tall man in a carpenter's apron worked quietly, surrounded by the sweet smell of cedar and varnish. His name was George Pocock. He was a master boat builder from England, and his sleek, handcrafted racing shells were considered the finest in the world. But Pocock was more than a craftsman. He was the quiet philosopher of rowing. He understood that a boat was more than just wood and nails. He knew a crew was more than just 9 athletes. He believed that when everything came together just right, something almost mystical happened. He called it swing. It was a state of perfect harmony where 9 men became one, moving together with a grace that transcended effort. As he'd say, it's a symphony of motion, nearing perfection, and when you near perfection, you're touching the divine. Joe Rantz, the boy who trusted no one, was about to learn the meaning of that symphony, but first, he had to survive the brutal training. The boys started on Old Nero, a wide, clumsy training barge. It was back-breaking, bewildering work. Joe's hands blistered and bled. His muscles screamed. But with each passing day, he noticed something satisfying. Fewer and fewer boys were making the long climb back up to campus. The first to quit were the ones with perfectly pressed trousers. The pain was taking its toll, and that was just fine with Joe. Hurting was nothing new to him. By late October, Joe and his friend Roger Morris had made the first cut and moved from the barge into sleeker shell barges. Joe was bursting with pride. His hard work was paying off. He was rowing every day, then working at the student store until midnight, and then working as a janitor at the YMCA in exchange for a tiny cell-like basement room. It wasn't home, but it was a start, and he had Joyce. She'd followed him to Seattle, working as a live-in maid to pay for her own tuition. They'd meet for cheap dates, mixing ketchup and hot water for tomato soup in the cafeteria. But they had each other. One cold November evening after a frigid workout, Coach Bolas announced the rosters for the first and second freshman boats. Joe's name was called for the first boat. He clenched his fist in a small, private celebration. That night, the 9 boys of the first boat took a shell out for a celebratory row on the dark waters of Lake Union. The city noise fell away. All Joe could hear was the rhythmic bark of the coxswain, and the gentle murmur of his oar dipping into black water. City lights danced on the waves. As the boat glided to a stop, Joe looked at the scene, and for the first time since his family abandoned him, tears filled his eyes. He didn't know where they came from. But for a few fragile moments, breathing in sync with 8 other boys, he felt like part of a single, living thing. For the first time, he felt a flicker of what it meant to belong. That freshman crew was something special. They were rugged and optimistic, sons of loggers, fishermen, and farmers. They were used to hard work and had a swagger about them. In April 1934, they faced their first big test, the annual Pacific Coast Regatta, against their arch-rivals, the University of California at Berkeley. On race day, in front of 80,000 roaring fans on Lake Washington's shores, the Washington freshmen did something extraordinary. They rowed at a deceptively low, powerful stroke rate, letting Cal burn themselves out early. Then, in the final stretch, they unleashed their power and sliced across the finish line 4.5 lengths ahead, shattering the course record. Joe was euphoric. He and Joyce danced on the student ferry deck, giddy under blue Seattle sky. Their victory sent them to the national championships in Poughkeepsie, New York. In the oppressive heat and humidity of the Hudson River, they did it again, winning the freshman national title with stunning ease. They rowed so serenely, so completely in control, that at the finish line, instead of collapsing, they sat bolt upright, looking calmly around as if they'd just been out for a casual paddle. The New York sports writers were stunned. A newspaper back in Seattle made a bold prediction. Count this Washington freshman outfit as a potential Olympic lineup in 1936. The idea began taking root in Al Ulbrickson's mind, too. The 1936 Olympics would be held in Berlin. Getting there would be the crowning achievement of his career, and these boys, he thought, just might have what it takes. But the path to glory is never straight. Their sophomore year in 1935 was a complete disaster. The swagger they'd earned as freshmen turned into arrogance. They became individuals again, bickering and losing focus. They lost race after race in practice to the older junior varsity boat. Ulbrickson was furious. He moved Joe in and out of the boat, trying to find a spark. Nothing worked. Joe was at the heart of the problem. He was still Mr. Individuality, rowing his own race, unable to fully trust the boys around him. The others felt it. His inconsistency was dragging the whole boat down. George Pocock saw what was happening. One afternoon, he called Joe up to his workshop. He didn't talk about technique. He talked about wood. He showed Joe the growth rings in a cedar plank, explaining how they told the story of the tree's life, the hard years and good years, the fires and storms it had endured. He told Joe that a racing shell had to have life and resiliency. It had to be in harmony. Then he looked at Joe and said rowing was like that too. "If you don't like some fellow in the boat, Joe," he said, "you have to learn to like him. It has to matter to you whether he wins the race, not just whether you do." He told Joe that when you really start trusting the other boys, you'll feel a power far beyond anything you've imagined. Pocock's words resonated deep within Joe. He'd spent his whole life building walls, teaching himself to rely on no one. Pocock was asking him to tear them down. He was asking him to trust. That fall, Joe's world shook again. His stepmother Thula died suddenly. Then his father Harry did something unexpected. He began building a new house on Lake Washington's shores, a house for all of them, and asked Joe to come home. Joe didn't know if he could trust him. But as he started helping his father build that house, and as he and Joyce began caring for his younger half-siblings, something inside him began to shift. The anger and resentment he'd carried for so long began to soften. He was starting to learn what Pocock meant by harmony. As the 1936 Olympic year began, Al Ulbrickson became a man obsessed. He announced to his team that their objective was Berlin. He broke up the old crews and started experimenting, searching for the perfect combination of 9 men. Joe bounced from boat to boat, his hopes rising and falling with each new roster posted on the chalkboard. Then, one afternoon in late March, Ulbrickson made his final move. He put Joe in the number 7 seat of a boat stroked by stoic sophomore Don Hume and coxed by brilliant Bobby Mauch. The boat mixed boys from different classes, including Joe's old friends Roger Morris and Shorty Hunt, and his new friends from Grand Coulee Dam, Johnny White and Chuck Day. From the moment they pushed off from the dock, something was different. The boat flew. It was the last change Ulbrickson had to make. This was the boat. This was the crew he'd try to take to the Olympics. George Pocock christened their new shell the Husky Clipper, with sauerkraut juice to get it used to Germany. Now we need to turn our attention eastward, to the city they hoped to conquer. While the boys in Seattle struggled with their boats and their lives, Germany was transforming itself. Under Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, Berlin was being turned into a vast, glittering stage set. The Jews not welcome signs came down. Vicious anti-Semitic newspapers disappeared from view, streets were scrubbed, buildings painted, and a million smiling faces prepared to greet the world. The goal was presenting a picture of a peaceful, modern, hospitable nation. It was masterful deception, a grand illusion designed to mask the darkness gathering beneath. Back in America, the boys in the Husky Clipper had their own mountain to climb. First, they faced Cal again on Lake Washington. This time, conditions were treacherous, with a stiff tailwind whipping up whitecaps. But Bobby Mauch, the coxswain, executed a brilliant race plan. He had Don Hume hold the stroke rate deceptively low, conserving energy, while Cal battled rough water at a high, exhausting pace. Then, in the final stretch, Mauch unleashed his crew. The Husky Clipper surged forward like a thing alive, winning by 3 lengths and shattering another course record. Seattle exploded with pride. They held a ticker-tape parade for their returning heroes. But the journey was far from over. Next came the national championships at Poughkeepsie. The memory of last year's losses haunted Ulbrickson. He and Pocock devised a new, daring race plan. They'd start deliberately slow, letting the entire field pull ahead, conserving power for a monstrous final push. The night of the race was dark and misty. As the gun fired, the Washington boat did exactly as planned, falling 5 full lengths behind the leaders. On the observation train, Al Ulbrickson sat like a man of stone, his face ashen. He thought they'd overplayed their hand. It looked like suicide. But Bobby Mauch knew what he was doing. He'd held his crew back like a coiled spring. With just over a mile to go, he finally turned them loose. The Husky Clipper began moving through the field. It was a sight of terrifying beauty. They passed Columbia. They passed Navy. In the final, breathtaking stretch, they caught and passed California, crossing the finish line a full length ahead. They'd done it. They'd won the national championship and swept all 3 races on the Hudson. Sports writers called it one of the greatest comebacks in rowing history. But their greatest test still lay ahead, the Olympic trials at Princeton, a short, explosive 2,000-meter sprint. California was considered the superior sprinting crew. The pressure was crushing. The night before the final race, the boys couldn't sleep. They walked along Lake Carnegie's shore under a full moon, talking quietly, reminding themselves who they were and what they'd accomplished together. A sense of calm resolve settled over them. In the final race, they got off to a terrible start. Penn and Cal shot into the lead. But once again, Don Hume settled the crew into a powerful rhythmic beat. They rode with fluid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. They passed Cal. They pulled even with Penn. In the last 500 meters, Mauch called for everything they had. The stroke rate climbed to 40. The Husky Clipper surged forward, and in the final 20 strokes, they blew past Penn to win by a full length. They were going to the Olympics. But there was one last, cruel twist. The American Olympic Committee was broke. Henry Penn Burke, head of the rowing committee, told Ulbrickson that if they wanted Berlin, they'd have to raise $5,000 to pay their own way. And they had less than a week to do it. Back in Seattle, the city rallied. The Seattle Times put out the call. College girls went door to door with tin cans. Businesses wrote checks. In just 2 days, the city raised the money. Their boys were going. They sailed for Germany on the SS Manhattan, a giddy crew of working-class kids on the adventure of a lifetime. Joe Rantz, standing on the Empire State Building's deck, looked down at the city and realized he now represented something much larger than himself. A way of life, a set of values. They arrived in a Berlin, draped in swastikas, a city putting on its best face for the world. But their final challenge wasn't the Germans, Italians, or British. It was within their own boat. Don Hume, their rock-solid stroke, was desperately ill. He'd lost 14 pounds and was running a fever. Ulbrickson decided he couldn't row in the final, but the boys refused. They went to their coach as one. "If you put him in the boat," Joe said, "we'll pull him across the line." Ulbrickson relented. And so we arrive back at that moment, on the Langer Sea, in Lane 6, the worst lane, with a sick man at the heart of their crew. And then the unthinkable happens. They miss the start. The starter, hidden from their view, drops his flag. 4 boats are gone. The Husky Clipper sits dead in the water. They're a stroke and a half behind, before they've even begun. What follows is perhaps the greatest race in Olympic history. Bobby Mauch calls for a high, desperate stroke rate just to stay in the race. Out in exposed water, they battle wind and waves, falling farther and farther behind. At the halfway mark, they're dead last. Down at the finish line, Ulbrickson watches through his binoculars, his heart sinking. On the balcony beside him, Hitler and Goebbels smile as the German and Italian boats fight for the lead in sheltered lanes. In the American boat, Bobby Mauch is desperate. Don Hume has gone pale, eyes closed. He's rowing like a ghost, an automaton. Mauch screams at him to pick up the pace. Nothing. Then, with about 800 meters to go, something happens. Hume's head snaps up. His eyes open. He looks at Mauch. And Mauch knows. He's back. He calls for a higher rate. 36. 37. The Husky Clipper begins to move. It's a slow, agonizing crawl at first. They pass Hungary. They pass Switzerland. With 500 meters to go, they're still a full length behind Germany and Italy. But now they're in more sheltered water. The playing field is finally even, and they've found their swing. Bobby Mauch begins to lie. "We're on them," he screams. He calls for 10 big strokes, then 10 more. He starts banging the wooden knockers on the hull's side, a frantic, desperate rhythm. The boat surges. Don Hume, the sick boy from Anacortes, takes the stroke rate to 40, then 42, then an unheard-of 44. They're flying. They hit a wall of sound as they draw alongside the grandstands. 75,000 Germans are screaming, "Deutschland!" The noise is so loud, Mauch's voice gets swallowed. The boys can't hear him. They can only feel the frantic beat he's pounding on the hull. The German and Italian boats fight back. It's neck and neck. 3 boats storming toward the finish line, locked together. In that final, searing stretch, something Pocock told him flashes through Joe's mind, that there's a reservoir of power you can draw on when your everyday strength is gone. That's how champions are made. In that moment, Joe Rantz finally lets go of everything, the fear, the doubt, the years of self-reliance. He throws himself into each stroke with absolute faith, knowing, not just believing, but knowing that the 8 other boys in the boat are there with him. In a final, extraordinary burst of speed, they hurl the Husky Clipper across the finish line. For a moment, there's silence, confusion. Then the loudspeaker crackles. The United States of America had won the gold medal by 0.6 of a second. The roar of the German crowd dies. On the balcony, Hitler turns and walks away. In the boat, the boys from Washington slump over their oars, gasping, their faces shattered by pain, but their hearts full. Joe Rantz, the abandoned boy from Sequim, had finally found his home. He was whole. The story of the boys in the boat is one of those rare tales that feels mythical, but is deeply, profoundly true. On the surface, it's a thrilling sports story, a classic underdog tale of triumph against impossible odds. And if that's all it were, it would still be remarkable. But its real power, the reason it stays with you, lies in the deeper currents running beneath the surface. This is a story about the character of a generation. These 9 young men were shaped by the Great Depression. They knew what it meant to have nothing, to work for every scrap, to face a world offering no guarantees. That hardship didn't break them. It forged them. It gave them humility, grit, and an appreciation for the simple value of a day's work that became the foundation of their greatness. They weren't entitled. They weren't privileged. They were just decent, hard-working kids who refused to give up. And in that, they represent the very best of what we imagine ourselves to be. But the most powerful lesson for me is Joe Rantz's journey. His story is a testament to human resilience. Here's a boy who was cast aside repeatedly by the very people who should have protected him. He learned, out of bitter necessity, to rely on no one but himself. He built a fortress around his heart. And yet his greatest victory wasn't winning a gold medal. It was learning to tear down that fortress. It was discovering that true strength isn't found in rugged individualism, but in the willingness to trust others, to become part of something larger than yourself. George Pocock, the quiet boat builder, said it best. The goal of rowing is to achieve, quote, the losing of self entirely to the cooperative effort of the crew as a whole. That's a profound lesson, not just for rowing, but for life. In a world that constantly encourages us to think about me, this story is a powerful reminder of the incredible power of we. What these boys found in that boat was more than just speed. They found harmony, balance, and rhythm. They found perfect synchronicity that transformed 9 individuals into a single, unified force. They found swing, and in finding it, they found a kind of redemption for themselves and for a nation that desperately needed to believe in itself again. So what can we take away from this today? First, understand that your greatest challenges often contain the seeds of your greatest strengths. The hardship Joe Rantz endured forged the willpower that made him an Olympic champion. Don't run from difficulty. See it as an opportunity to discover who you truly are. Second, find your boat. Find that team, that family, that community where you can lose yourself in a common effort. Whether it's a sports team, a creative project, or a cause you believe in, find a place where you can pull together with others. Because the fulfillment you'll find there is something you can never achieve alone. Finally, learn to trust. This was Joe's hardest and most important lesson. It's scary to make yourself vulnerable, to rely on others. But it's the only path to true connection, and to unlocking that mysterious reservoir of power that exists when people come together pursuing a common goal. That was a summary of The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. We've certainly sailed through the main currents of this incredible story today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only show you the surface of the water. The real magic, the true depth of this story, happens when you read the book yourself. It's in the quiet moments when a particular description of a cold Seattle morning or a simple phrase from George Pocock hits you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is your map, designed to show you if this is a journey worth taking. If anything we've talked about today has stirred something in you, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just learning a piece of history, it's an experience that can genuinely change how you see teamwork, resilience, and the power of the human heart. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you something to think about, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.